Good afternoon. Welcome back. Good afternoon, everybody. So we've just done some surgery in the schedule, and I just want to give you all the schedule so you know what's going to happen, the order of battle for the end of this meeting. We're going to have a panel on North Korea right now, and it's going to be from now until 3 o'clock. It's going to be chaired by Ken Delaney of NBC News. He's joined by Ben Rhodes, by Chris Hill. Ambassador Chris Hill was our North Korea negotiator for President George W. Bush and has a lot of experience in this field. Sumi Terry as well, and Jong-kun Choi. This is going to be a fabulous panel about whether or not the administration is on the right track on denuclearization in North Korea. At 3 o'clock, it's going to be a great pleasure to have Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin here with Congressman Mac Thornberry. And they're going to give us a perspective from Capitol Hill on authorizing for the Defense Department and for American national security, and to get their views on a lot of the issues that we've been discussing. And then finally, the final panel is going to be a panel that tries to sum up what we think about the last 2.5 days. And I'm going to interview two former chiefs of intelligence, Sir John Scarlett, who is chief of the British Secret Service organization MI6, and John McLaughlin, who is acting CIA director and deputy director for Central Intelligence. So two spooks, intelligence experts, give us their sense on what they've heard, what they make of it, what our conclusion should be. That'll take us until 4:30. At 4:30, we'll all walk over to Greenwald Tent, and Kristen Welker of NBC News will interview Congressman Adam Schiff from 5 to 6 p.m. on all the issues we've been discussing. So without further ado, Ken, thank you for chairing this panel.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. David Sanger talked about the diehards on Saturday, but these are the real diehards, Saturday afternoon in Aspen. So I'm Ken Delaney, and I cover national security and intelligence for NBC News. 2 years ago at this forum, those of you who were there will remember, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, told my colleague Andrea Mitchell that war with North Korea should not be considered unimaginable. What's unimaginable, he said, was the idea that North Korea would have the capability of striking Denver with a nuclear weapon. And a few weeks later, President Trump famously threatened North Korea with fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never seen. We're in a much different place today, thankfully. But how different is it really? That's what I hope this wonderful panel will chew over today. And so Nick already did the introductions, so I'm going to bypass that, but I just want to say I learned something wonderful about Sumi Terry this weekend, which is that her nickname at the CIA was Tsunami Sue, in connection with a paintball exercise in training, and I'll let her tell you that story offline. Okay, so we're going to talk about what's transpired and over the last few years and where this thing goes next. But I want to start with what's in the news right now, which is there's a joint exercise scheduled for August between the South Koreans and the U.S. military. And the North Koreans have objected to this. And they've said, the North Korean Foreign Ministry said, it's crystal clear that this is an actual drill and a rehearsal of war aimed at militarily occupying our republic by surprise attack. And further, there's a report that they claim that President Trump promised to cancel this exercise during the last summit. So I want to ask all of you to sort of analyze what's going on here. Is it credible that President Trump did promise to cancel this exercise? Sumi Terry, go ahead.
I think it's plausible. I mean, who knows? We don't know, but I think it's plausible that he could have promised Kim that. But I mean, this is not a large-scale exercises. These are very scaled-down drills, right? It's a mostly computer simulated training exercise to assess, verify operational capability of transfer of wartime operational control. I mean, this is very scaled down version. So I think the fact that North Koreans are making a fuss about this are either they are trying to, this is what they do, right? North Korea's whole diplomatic strategy is based on a combination of charm offensive and coercion. So they want to increase their leverage when negotiations do begin, working level negotiations. Or they're trying to sort of buy out time. And they want to this is sort of their way to make this as an excuse and not engage in working level negotiations because they were never really into it, right? They were always trying to separate President Trump from his advisors. If you see the whole past year, a lot of criticisms of his advisors, Secretary Pompeo, calling Ambassador Bolton human defect while he's still sending beautiful love letter to President Trump. So either I think this is sort of a tactical move on North Korea's part to increase their leverage or way to buy time.
Yeah, and I'd just say, I was rarely accused of being a hawk in the Obama administration, and I very much support diplomacy with North Korea. I led our diplomacy with Cuba, I was involved with Iran. A couple points, though. The first thing is with the exercises. Often you hear about this and you wonder, why is this so important? We deploy our troops through South Korea on rotation, right? So people are not there in perpetuity, the troops that are there. And the entire model for how we would respond to a contingency on the Korean Peninsula depends upon interoperability, coordination with the South Korean military. And so if you have troops who have not yet practiced, essentially, for different contingencies on the Korean Peninsula, they're not ready, they're not battle ready. And so these joint exercises are not just for show, they're actually just to make sure that the South Korean military and the American military that is rotating through is prepared for the different contingencies. So it actually does matter. Obviously, some of this is optics, but this gets at our preparedness on the Korean Peninsula. And not just North Korea, but the Chinese have frequently complained about these exercises for years, in part because what they would really like in the long run is to see the US military presence in South Korea end. And this is seen as a step on the pathway towards ending the US military presence on the Korean Peninsula.
Dr. Choi, as the representative of the South Korean government here, is it your understanding that this exercise will proceed? The Indo-PACOM commander told this forum a few days ago that his orders were to proceed.
Hi, before I begin say anything, I'd like to introduce myself. I work for the Blue House, which is the Presidential Office of the Republic of Korea. My official title is Presidential Secretary for Peace Planning. So I've been involved in this government for the last 2 years. And just for the record, government of the Republic of Korea has been taking this joint military exercise very seriously. And so far we have either suspended or canceled 2 joint military exercises. One's called Key Resolve and Foul Eagle, which we suspended last year sometime in March. And after that we had very first inter-Korean summit in Panmunjom, joint security area, followed by Singapore summit. And then we had another summit in Pyongyang. In other words, joint military exercise has been very critical, not only in bringing about the cohesiveness of the military alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea. And the combat readiness has never been compromised because while we have been suspending or canceling the large-size military exercise, small scale, that is so critical to maintaining field training exercise has been ongoing. So I just want to say for the record that military interoperability has never been compromised. Way that I understand in terms of things that North Korea has been projecting outside, especially the joint military exercise, is that historically, even between Seoul and Pyongyang, we would not, or they would not have any type of dialogue or negotiation if there is any type of joint military exercise. So what happened is, I think that they've been following so-called historical track. If there is going to be joint military exercise in the territory of South Korea, We are not going to have so-called working level negotiation with you. So I think that they've been basically sounding out what they have been saying. Second of all, I don't think that, as far as I know, President Trump did not promise the cancellation of this upcoming joint military exercise. If he had ever done that, then he would have, as we have done so far, we would have consulted and organized it and used it as a very strategically. So I think that this is a very critical moment for us. Now, Washington and Seoul has been looking this matter very carefully. And I think, and also the nature of this joint military exercise is called IOC exercise, which is Initial Operation Capability Exercise. Why? Because the Republic of Korea is trying to get our wartime operational back to our command. Therefore, to get that wartime operational command, we need to have military exercise between the two commands so that we have a very smooth transition. So this nature of the exercise is not offensive, it's a transitional, and it's for the sake of strengthening the alliance.
Okay, let's pull back the lens a little bit. You've heard several people from the Trump administration at this panel, or at this conference, talk about the progress that they think has been made over the last 2 years in this relationship. They say that because of the 3 face-to-face meetings, because of the lack of nuclear testing, ballistic missile testing, we're in a much better place. Susan Rice, on the other hand, pushed back on that a little bit. Chris, why don't you go first? I want you all to talk about what do you think has been accomplished over the last 2 years by these very dramatic events?
Well, look, where we are today sure beats Little Rocket Man and Fire and Fury. So I think we could all agree on that. I think the problem, though, is, when I was doing this back during the Bush administration, they would always ask us to cancel exercises. And I'd always say no. And I'd always say my only regret is we didn't have them in the spring of 1950, an answer they never quite understood, but I thought it was obvious. So what is different now is the president comes out of the meetings in Singapore, and at a 3 o'clock press conference, just before he's leaving on Air Force One, he suddenly learns to speak North Korean, because we always call these joint exercises, and he gets up in this press conference and calls them hostile war games. Suggesting that they had raised this with him. And then he said, these exercises cost a lot of money. And I would say, frankly, exercises compared to actual wars cost very little money, but we won't go into that obvious point. So I think the president did kind of put this on the table. And I think the North Koreans are looking to see if they can weaken the links between the two armies. Because as Ben and Sue Mi have pointed out, these are, our army, our 29,000 troops there, and all the troops that rotate through, they don't rotate through to play softball. They rotate through to work with the ROK to make sure it's a seamless, very powerful military. And by the way, it's one of the most powerful in the world. So there's a lot to be concerned about. And I think ultimately, I'd just like to make one fundamental point, which is North Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons because they're afraid we're going to attack them or attack them after we've had some exercises. They have nuclear weapons because they want to create a circumstance that over time we somehow leave the Korean Peninsula. And I think we need to be more aware of that kind of strategic concept they have and maybe a little more stubborn in not giving into it.
Sue Mi, are they taking Donald Trump for a ride?
Well, so in theory, I support engagement, negotiation, dialogue, and I think you can argue that nothing has worked with North Korea, so we'll try this out at the highest level. But your question was, what have we seen since Singapore in the last 2 years? So I hope that we would have made more progress, and we didn't, right? Singapore, honestly, produced an aspirational statement of North Korea working towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I work towards a lot of things, and I don't accomplish a lot of them, right? So that's us working towards. It's an aspirational statement. We had 3 meetings between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, and we don't have a agreed upon definition of denuclearization. We don't have roadmap. We don't have a timeline. We certainly don't have a declaration. So we're all for engagement, but it's time to see something. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un had met with Xi Jinping maybe 5 times now, 4 times in China, hosted Xi, met with Putin, met with President Trump 3 times, went to Singapore, had a nice selfie, had a whole image makeover. Now he looks like a normal person of a normal country.
Boy, that's an exaggeration.
Yeah, right, that's true. But I mean, we now forget completely that Kim is someone who killed his half-brother using banned WMD. You know, I mean, we forget all of that, and now he looks like a normal person. So I didn't appreciate Kim's, I think he did quite well for last, since Singapore. I think he did quite well, and I didn't appreciate, I think I underestimated him. So if anything, I think Kim made more progress for North Korea than we, if our goal is still complete denuclearization, I don't see, honestly, that we have made progress, at least at this point. I
Dr.
hope
Choi,
to see that.
You were gesturing.
I mean, I try not to argue, but
Please argue. That's why we're here. It's the Aspen
I
Security
know
Forum.
that what Sumi just said is representative of the mainstream argument in Washington, D.C. However, as a person actually involved in the policy making, especially dealing with North Korea and denuclearization, compare ourselves with what happened in 2017 and the time before, I think we made a lot of progress. Why? Because, first of all, it used to be inconceivable in a way that President of the United States is directly engaging the chairman of the DPRK. Second of all, there was a declaration in Singapore that laid out 4 pillars of the relationship future ahead. I'm not saying that Singapore declaration is the most perfect declaration in the world, but think about it. We are talking about the process, and process that changes total history of the USA and DPRK and moving forward. I remember, I am, by the way, by training, a university professor teaching international politics, and started working from 18th of July 2017. So what happened was, Moon Jae-in government came into power 10th of May in 2017. I counted how many times North Korea conducted missile tests as well as nuclear tests. Every 20 days on average, from May 9 to 29th of November, North Korea tested 9 long-range missile tests and 1 nuclear test, meaning that every 20 days we had some sort of WMD test. And then we had 3 summits. We also had 2 declarations between 2 Koreas and 1 military agreement. In other words, you could say that the progress has not been made in terms of the denuclearization, but we got to the stage where both leaders agreed to have working level negotiation. Why is it? Because they cannot walk out twice, as they did in Hanoi. So that they got to the point where working level negotiations are pretty needed. So time will be a moment of very critical juncture in this fall, and I think, and I suspect, I'm very hopefully, I'm very hopeful. I am very optimistic about what's going to happen.
Ben,
so
are you
that
optimistic?
I think it's too early to say anything yet.
Do you share that optimism, Ben Rhodes?
Not entirely. And I want to say I'm very supportive of the Republic of Korea taking this stance. And in fact, we lacked a partner in Seoul, frankly, that supported engagement. And so I want to credit President Moon and his team for what they're doing. I think the issue is, what are we trying to achieve here? And if you look at the metrics of what we're trying to achieve, North Korea has not only not taken any steps to give up any pieces of its nuclear program, they're continuing to build nuclear weapons. So their program continues to advance. And so measured against the ultimate goal of denuclearization, but even if you accept, as I do, that is a very aspirational goal and something we're unlikely to reach in a near-term time frame, the types of things you'd want to see, a rollback of pieces of the nuclear infrastructure, access to North Korean facilities for international inspectors, remain elusive. And hopefully in the fall, that is the kind of step that could be arrived at. And I think there are a couple of things that we have to grapple with here, right? Insofar as there's been a significant improvement since 2017, it's been an improvement of a crisis of President Trump's own making in essentially ratcheting up towards a war on the Korean Peninsula and then ratcheting back down. And so I think we all appreciate that, but we're not seeing the results in terms of the nuclear program. The second thing that is important to note here is, if I look at the example of what we did on Iran, you don't start with a head of state summit, and you don't start with kind of bold declarations about transforming the relationship. You start somewhere concrete on the nuclear program. So we had an interim agreement 2.5 years before the Iran nuclear deal that essentially froze the Iranian program, rolled it back a bit for some very modest sanctions relief. Now, what I find with the Trump administration is after 3 years almost, they're circling back around to that step, which is the appropriate place to begin. I think part of what concerns me, though, is we sit here at the Aspen Security Forum and we talk about this as if there's a normal intent behind what is taking place emanating from the President of the United States. And from what I've seen, what President Trump seems to enjoy the most is the attention that comes from these summits and the sense that he's orchestrating the attention of the world between him and Kim Jong-un's personal relationship. The handshake at the DMV, very dramatic. The Singapore summit, very dramatic. But it's not in service of a process. It's not even connected down to his own negotiating team. And what you need to get progress on these types of issues is very methodical negotiation with nuclear experts, with sanctions experts, with legal experts, plowing the ground so that the President of the United States can then come in at the appropriate time and reach the agreement. Instead, here, you seem to have two tracks. You've got working level dialogue that is taking place, and then President Trump coming in on his own when he feels like he wants, again, the boost of the meeting with Kim Jong-un. So it's a very kind of discordant process to watch. So I think there's a likelihood that we could end up at some type of freeze for freeze or modest step in the fall, which would be the first step forward that we've seen. But again, all of the framing for these negotiations has been around what the North Koreans want. The North Koreans have always wanted the legitimacy that comes from international acceptance and a meeting with the President of the United States. And don't think for a second that all those meetings with Trump and all that praise from Trump isn't playing on a loop on North Korean state television to legitimize Kim Jong-un's rule. They've always wanted an end to the conflict because that's the predecessor to the US leaving the Korean Peninsula. So the way that we're talking about these things, putting peace before denuclearization, putting the head of state summits before the working level work, is exactly what the North Koreans want and not what I think most of us who've worked in government would think is the way you would go about doing it.
Let's unpack some of that because I think you tackled the big question. North Korea has, by some estimates, 60 nuclear weapons. Their testing suggests they have the capability to deliver a nuclear weapon potentially to the US mainland. Every intelligence official I've ever talked to about this says they have no intention of giving up their nuclear capability. They view it as essential to regime survival. So why do we persist in this notion that the ultimate goal is denuclearization? And isn't this freeze for freeze thing that you're talking about, isn't that the more reasonable way to go? And isn't the Trump administration coming around to embracing that?
I don't think that's the more reasonable way to go. I think if you end up with a freeze for freeze, what you have is a de facto nuclear state. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that's what we have anyway, so how can this be worse? Well, 60 nuclear weapons could do a lot of damage. But you have to ask yourself, I mean, you said that everybody, which is a lot of people, but everybody thinks this is about regime survival. I don't think it is. I think this is about creating the circumstance that if there's some pushing and shoving on the Korean Peninsula, the Americans have to think, okay, we're duty bound, we're treaty bound to get involved in that pushing and shoving, but do we want to do that if there's a greater than 0% chance that North Korea has the capability of hitting Los Angeles? Well, the answer to that is, boy, if they hit Los Angeles, we'll turn North Korea into a parking lot. Well, is that really a trade-off the American president wants to make? I mean, we don't need more parking there, and so
I live in Los Angeles too, so.
So how do we
well,
get
I could
there?
rethink the Los Angeles thing, but my point is, I think this nuclear arsenal. And by the way, the president makes a big deal about the fact they're not testing. Well, I did this from August 2005 through 2008. They never tested except when the talks had broken apart. So as long as you're talking to them, they probably won't test. So I think the real issue we have to be looking at is, can we create the structure by which they understand that a future with nuclear weapons is more difficult than a future without them? And I think a lot of this maximum pressure stuff was the way to go, combined with opening up a channel, which I think was also the way to go, combined with maybe broadening the diplomatic architecture. I mean, all the talks I heard about China today, I wanted to go out and start digging my bomb shelter. But I frankly think if we work with China establish some kind of pattern of cooperation on North Korea, maybe we can get the North Koreans around to the view that somehow this is hurting them rather than helping them.
I hope that's true, but so far they've said nothing to indicate they have.
This is a triumph of hope over experience. I get that.
Dr.
But,
Choi.
I mean, make no mistake, I'm not here to feed you guys with any fantasy that everything will be right. It's going to be tough and bumpy road ahead, as my president mentioned many times. But thing is, the crux of the matter here and on is that we need to raise the structure, as Chris just mentioned, so that nobody can walk out of this. In other words, I don't care whether Kim Jong-un is sincere or not. I don't care whether people in Washington or people in Seoul is really, really serious or not. But at the end of the day, what we want is that we want a sustainable process where North Korea basically works toward denuclearization. And also, as a citizen of Seoul, a city of more than 10 million population, located in the 40 miles south of the DMZ, war and peace is not a choice because it totally affects daily life of ordinary citizens. In other words, people here in Washington, in Paris, London, can talk about many things in regards to the future of North Korea. What really impacts us is that we cannot coexist with nuclear North Korea. My administration has been very clear about it. Any type of the administration in South Korea has been very clear that Korea, the Korean Peninsula, has to be free of nuclear weapon, free of nuclear facilities to produce nuclear weapon-graded material, and no nuclear weapon stored in the Korean Peninsula. That should be the end state of the denuclearization. What we need is a clear roadmap and also comprehensive agreement to get to that end state. And also, we need to build up the milestones so that nobody can walk out.
Sumi Terry, you looked at these issues inside the CIA. Is there any dissent in the intelligence community against the notion that North Korea is extremely unlikely to ever give up its nuclear weapons?
Well, you said never before. So
Okay, I'm qualifying.
Highly unlikely with high confidence, highly unlikely. You don't want to say never, but highly unlikely. But I think what we can get to is some sort of an interim deal. And I think we're actually headed in that direction, freeze or North, because in Hanoi, actually, United States was we were about to make some concessions. We were ready to open liaison offices. We were okay about giving a peace declaration to North Korea. It all fell apart because North Korea came with such maximalist demands to have 5 UNSC sanctions removed. But I think we're headed in the direction where there's an interim deal, and you can debate whether that's it's a good deal or it's a substantive deal. But I think North Korea will offer maybe Yongbyon facility plus something, and we can, from 0 sanctions lifted to 5 UNSC sanctions being lifted, there's something in the middle, and I think that interim deal can be reached. Now, will we ever get to denuclearization? I have to be honest, let's realistically speaking, if you're very candid about it, I think the most likely, the best optimistic scenario is in which North Korea pretends that they give up. At least they are committed to pretending, and we pretend that they are giving it up. So it's kind of like, and that's okay. I mean, you can still argue whether this is still a better scenario than not, where North Korea is continually working on accelerating their nuclear missile program. But that's the most realistic scenario.
Somebody has to remember today is the 20th of July. So sometime next year, we have to see what's going to happen. So in other words, if we essentially be in a better position, what I mean by better position next year is that we might have some sort of working level discussion ongoing, no test, yet we'll get to the very clear picture of what the end state should be. And remind you that this denuclearization process itself is a long-term process. We talk about Yongbyon very easily, but in Yongbyon complex, there are about 300 to 400 buildings there. I went to the Ohio State University, which is the largest university in the United States. It has about 200 buildings. And remember and imagine tackling it down and taking all the buildings out, and it's going to take more than 2-3 years, and only the United States can do it.
And just so we understand, I mean, this is an educated audience, and I think you know this, but you guys have all had access to classified intelligence. Is there any scenario under which a U.S. military strike could take out all of North Korea's nuclear capability and its ability to rain artillery shells down on Seoul?
No.
No.
And I'm just going to say flat out no. And there's another problem here. Seoul, I mean, as Mr. Choi very eloquently said, they're very close to North Korea. I mean, to paraphrase Sarah Palin, you can see North Korea from your bedroom window. So if you're going to start attacking North Korea, you better tell South Korea. And if South Korea receives that information, what are they going to do with tens of millions of people? Are they going to keep it quiet from them in the hope that North Korea doesn't react? Or are they going to start getting people into bomb shelters? That's a big task. And then if you're not going to tell South Korea, well, there's no more alliance at that point. So this fantasy that we can somehow take out their, quite apart from the question of where, this is the most tunneled society in the world, this fantasy that we can attack all their sites and succeed is just that. So I think people need to get real. And I must say, to pick up on Sumi's point, I think a step-by-step approach, which I did to the point that John Bolton called me Kim Jong-il for doing it, but I think a step-by-step approach is the right approach. I don't think they're going to fall out of bed one morning and say, let's give up these nuclear weapons today.
And what's so interesting about that, Ben, is that there's evidence that the Trump administration is considering that. My colleague David Sanger reported that they were. John Bolton pushed back and said the story was false, but Trump himself has made comments that make you think that he's willing to do an interim deal. Ben, talk about that.
Well, I think it's because it's the only viable pathway, because they're not just going to come out with their hands up and give up every bolt and screw of their nuclear weapons program. So I do think a step-by-step approach would represent some progress. There's another dynamic here, though, that needs to be brought in, because to your point about, well, they're not going to give it up, and so what's the harm, essentially, in acceding to this status? It's also, any negotiation like this takes place in a broader international context, right? And there are two things that really concern me about how this has gone forward. One involving nonproliferation and one involving the Asia-Pacific region. On nonproliferation, the more in which you seem to grant the legitimacy of North Korea's acceptance of nuclear weapons, and this is why Sue's right, you have to at least act like they're not being, as someone who violated the nonproliferation treaty, they're not being given essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card, is you're loosening the norm against the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the near term. In the medium and long term, frankly, you may be setting off a dynamic in the Asia-Pacific region where I'm a Japan, and I'm even potentially a Republic of Korea, not under this administration, or other countries in that neighborhood who start to say, well, they have their nuclear weapons, we need them now too. And so you have a scenario where you have proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Asia-Pacific region, and that also sends messages globally. The second thing that concerns me is the way in which I talked about the process within the US government of making sure everybody's on the same page, which is going to be impossible in this negotiation as long as John Bolton is National Security Advisor. There's also the coordination in the region, and President Trump rushed this without consulting, I think, appropriately with Japan. Personally, I didn't see the type of consultation that we would have done with the Republic of Korea. In the long run, what China would like to do, and North Korea probably as well, is drive wedges between U.S. allies, between the U.S. and our allies, and between our allies in the Asia-Pacific, so that essentially they value U.S. credibility less, whether you're Japan or the Republic of Korea or other treaty allies in that region. And then the Chinese go in and start to pick them off and say, well, look, we're here, we're a bigger trading partner, why do you even have these US troops here? Or why are you invested in a US-led international order? And so I worry that the way in which this is being conducted, not as part of a broader engagement strategy in the Asia-Pacific, not valuing allies, but disparaging allies and raising questions about why do we pay to keep troops in Japan, all of this is playing right into the Chinese could not have scripted it better for them to be able to essentially discredit US leadership in Asia-Pacific and try to pick off countries, drive wedges between countries. So again, we have to bear in mind, it's not just about this bilateral issue between the US and North Korea, or even the trilateral issue bringing in the Republic of Korea. It's also about what is the strategic context and what is this doing to that strategic context. And I think it's playing right into China's long-term play.
I want to take audience questions.
I just want to add one more thing, because Sumi mentioned a couple of things that we had in play. One, peace treaty. This is predicated on the notion that little North Korea sits there worrying every day that the U.S. is going to invade them. But gosh, if we gave them a peace treaty, they'd feel so much safer about that. It would be sort of, some Wizard of Oz thing where they get this and they go, oh, this is wonderful. We don't need to worry about the U.S. I submit to you the peace treaty idea is not going to solve this problem unless it comes in the broader and final context of denuclearization. The second thing was the idea that we were going to establish an interest section in North Korea, and what could be better than that? Well, the Chinese came to me with that back in 2006. I said, okay, we'd love to establish a thing, but I've got to get Washington's permission. I go back, the president said, you got to be kidding. Condi Rice saw the point, convinced the president, convinced others, even convinced John Rood. John, are you here? No.
Oh, he's there.
He's there.
Everyone was in favor of telling the North Koreans we would have an interest section in North Korea. So I meet with the North Koreans in Berlin. I said, Mr. Kim, have I got good news for you? We have agreed to establish an interest section in Pyongyang, and you can have an interest section in Washington. It'll facilitate, and I didn't even finish my sentence before Kim said no, or words to that effect. He didn't even say, thank you very much, let me check with Pyongyang. He just said no. So be careful about thinking they want something, because often they want it until they don't. And you may have lifted heaven and earth to get something for them, and then they stare at you like, what are you talking about? So we got to keep our eye on the ball, and that is denuclearization, and stop thinking that little gestures are going to solve the problem.
We need to take questions from the audience, but I just want to ask Sumi Terry or Dr. Choi, what about the role of China? Over the last 2 years, has the Trump administration's policies and the trade war in the larger context, what impact has that played on China's involvement in the North Korea issue?
One thing I can confidently share with you people is that China has been very productive, because 95% of the trade with the rest of the world, as far as North Korea is concerned, happened with China. And China has been very diligent in pushing and sanctioning North Korea. And North Korea's economy has been shrunk and hit very hard by sanction itself. And that would mean that this approach to North Korea, obviously highly driven by Mr. President Trump, but at the same time, the regional states in Northeast Asia surrounding North Korea has been very much consulting and coordinating with the Washington itself. So that it was very agent-driven, and also allies and neighboring states' effort altogether.
Terrific. Okay, questions from the audience. Right here, sir, the blue blazer.
Hi, I'm Thomas Silvis. I'd re-ask a question I asked on my panel 2 days ago. After the failure of the UK and the United States to come to Ukraine's aid for the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, why would any country ever again want to denuclearize? And I don't think that lesson was lost on Kim Jong-un.
Who would like to take?
Can I take a whack at that? I mean, the North Koreans are not integrated thinkers. They don't sort of look at Ukraine as having a particular relevance to them. They might use Ukraine or Libya, that's another favorite example, and they might use those countries as an example of why they can't trust us. So I understand the logic of what you're saying, but ultimately the fundamental logic is they need to look at their future, and do they have a better future with those weapons or without those weapons? And so they've got to look at that. Now, I know exactly what you're talking about in Ukraine, and that is a great subject for a Ukraine panel. But on North Korea, I think we need to make clear to them that we have a lot of options, but we don't have the option to walk away from this. If they open up a bank account on the moon, We will send Elon, what's his name, up to the moon, and we'll shut it down there too. I mean, we're going to make their lives miserable wherever they are. And I think it takes time. It's not going to be done in this big bang show that the president has. We're going to have interim deals in the meantime. But I think ultimately, nuclear weapons will not, quote, guarantee their survival. What will is a better country.
I think the more relevant example is also the JCPOA.
Yeah, that too.
Because essentially, that's the formula that we're talking about with North Korea. Some version of sanctions relief in exchange for some version of rolling back your nuclear program. And the fact that you had a deal that the entire international community had endorsed in the UN Security Council resolution, that had all the major powers that Iran was complying with, and then you had the US pull out of that because of political reasons, loathing of my former boss or whatever it was. The North Koreans are watching that and thinking, well, if the US doesn't abide by international agreements in which countries agree to remove their nuclear capacity in exchange for sanctions relief, we can't really trust the US. President Trump won't be here forever. So to me, I think that this is a version of the JCPOA being something that ironically undercuts what they're trying to do with North Korea.
I think they go before that. I mean, they already have experience with 1994 Agreed Framework. They blamed the Bush administration when they came in to sort of scuttering that agreement.
Don't point at me.
No,
I'm just a career foreign service officer.
They understand that we are a democracy and we have a changeover and things fall apart. But I do think I want to sort of push back against a little bit of what you said in this sense. Why can't North Korea have both? Why can't they have a little bit of economic development and nuclear weapons? And I truly think this is where they're headed. Already, as I said, they have a sort of an image makeover. So imagine a couple more years down this road. The freeze for freeze proposal does allow North Korea to keep all their nuclear capability. So why can they not have nuclear weapons? I think this is what Kim wants. Have nuclear weapons and some economic development.
And his cake, eat
right.
his cake
no,
too.
Absolutely have his cake and eat it too. So I sort of push back against this notion that we're going to somehow be able to make him eat either nukes or economic development. I think he's trying to go and have both, and I think honestly, he's headed in that direction in the future where he will gain international acceptance of North Korea as a responsible nuclear weapons power, which is
with
its
an
ultimate
absolutely
goal.
horrific human rights record, which we haven't even talked about.
I mean,
yet.
it's a
Question in the back.
Can I just say, as a fact of political, what U.S. president can get up and say, well, I took a whack at this and I really couldn't solve it, so we're just going to have to make them a nuclear state?
They wouldn't
We won't
that.
say it.
Yeah.
We won't say it. It's not something that you say, but this is why I say they pretend to do it, and we pretend that they are doing it.
Ma'am, in the back.
Wendon Smith, a former DoD official on counter-WMD programs, now with Deloitte. Question for you, looking ahead, in maybe particularly framing it in a step-by-step framework, which some of you have alluded to. Your thoughts on where chemical and biological weapons come in. I personally believe those are too often overlooked in the community, let alone more broadly, as to how to plug those into the broader discussion of denuclearization. Thanks.
Good question. Who wants to take that one? What do we do about those weapons?
Chem bio,
Yes.
vitally important, except when you're talking about nuclear weapons.
Any other thoughts? I mean, do those get included in an agreement, or we
It
just
should
ignore
be.
them?
I do think there's a logic in addressing the nuclear issue on its own. That doesn't mean, part of the issue here in general too is that there's lots of other behavior. There's chem bio, there's North Korea's cyber activity, there's North Korea's human rights record. So we have a lot of fish to fry here with the North Koreans. I do think nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons is obviously a distinct
I
challenge.
think we have time for one
And
more.
Can you mention the human rights issue? I told the North Koreans, and I think this should be our position, that if we make progress on denuclearization, and if we get to the point where we're talking about mutual diplomatic recognition, we discuss diplomatic recognition on a number of lanes, one of which is human rights. And we're not looking to set the bar really high, but we're looking for a situation where their human rights starts going in the right direction. So I wouldn't just forget about that issue. I would just bring it up in the context if we get to that phase where we're normalizing.
Last question, right here.
I don't get this. Maybe I'm dumb. Why do I care? Why are we, a very rich country, with freedom.
Yeah.
He's saying, why should we care about
Yeah, it's a broken country. Communism has always failed. There's nothing you'd want to buy from North Korea.
I think it's the part about the nuclear weapon that maybe can hit Denver.
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
want
yeah,
you guys
yeah,
to talk about that.
No, but if we stay strong, we will prevail. And I don't think we should. I think Trump was crazy. He took this midget and he made him into a giant. But he's still a midget.
Fair point. Who wants to take that one?
Want to take on the midget question? Or?
And this is it. We're wrapping up. Dr. Choi.
I'll be, since I'll be flying about 14, 15 hours back to Seoul, so hopefully I can make a comment, especially the gentleman that raised why would Kim Jong-un give up? My sincere question is, I really do not know, because who knows what's going to happen in the future. But that question gives us very important task ahead. In other words, I'll tweak the question and reframe it and raise it with another question that what can we do to make sure that Kim Jong-un gives up? Because that's what diplomats and strategic thinkers do. We cannot let this happen, let it loose. I'm not going to comment on anything about the past administration's policy toward North Korea, but what happened was, if we're not doing anything, if we're not doing anything constructive about North Korea, then North Korea would nurture their nuclear program, incubate it, and increase it, while as you care more about it, they would do bad things about human rights in their country.
Thank you all very much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the Aspen Security Forum.
Please remain seated as we're going to turn around the stage very quickly and begin the next session.